Shadow's wet nose touched Michael's palm. The tears silently flowing from the man's eyes dampened the dog's fur. Around them rose the walls of a dark, dilapidated room. Moonlight seeping through the window cast their intertwined silhouettes against the wall. "You never left me," Michael whispered with a trembling voice. "Everyone else gone. But you stayed." Shadow whimpered softly, as if saying, "I'll never leave." Michael remembered the day he first met Shadow at the military training facility. Major Bennett had approached him after the morning drills, leading a lean German shepherd with intelligent eyes. "Hayes, this one's special," Bennett had said, his weathered face serious. "Failed the aggression tests. Too gentle, they said. Was about to be discharged from the program." Michael had knelt down, his uniform still crisp then, and Shadow had immediately pressed his head against his palm, the same way he did now, 5 years and countless missions later. Captain Ramirez had warned him, "Don't get attached, Hayes. These aren't pets." But Shadow had proven himself in Afghanistan when their convoy was ambushed. While bullets flew overhead, Shadow had dragged an injured Private Wilson to safety before returning to Michael's side, calm amidst chaos. Now, in this abandoned building that had once been someone's home, with walls scarred by conflict, Michael's military medals were gone, pawned for food weeks ago. The Purple Heart had fetched enough for 3 days' meals. The Bronze Star, barely enough for Shadow's medicine when he'd developed an infection from a cut on his paw. "Remember Specialist Garcia?" Michael whispered, scratching behind Shadow's ear. "How he'd sneak you extra rations?" Shadow's ears perked up at the familiar name. Garcia had been Shadow's second favorite person in their unit, always carrying dog treats in his pocket until the day his Humvee hit an IED. Michael had written to Garcia's mother afterward, telling her how her son had saved 3 lives that day. The letter was returned unopened. Outside, a December wind howled through the broken windows, bringing with it memories of another winter, their first operation in the mountains, where Shadow had kept Michael warm during a snowstorm when they were separated from their unit for 48 hours. The dog looked up at his human, loyalty unwavering in his amber eyes. In that moment, Michael made a silent promise. No matter how desperate things got, they would face it together. Michael no longer wore his military uniform. As his fingers got lost in the dog's fur, he looked at the small bag sitting against the opposite wall of the room. It contained just a few remaining possessions, 2 meals worth of food, and some kibble for Shadow. They had nothing else left. Outside, a cold December wind was howling. The lights dimly shimmered on an old bench at the bus stop. Midnight had long passed. Lieutenant Michael Hayes, middle-aged, wearing a worn-out jacket, sat with a large bag beside him, and his faithful German shepherd Shadow lying under the bench. Across the street, the 24-hour diner where Michael had tried to get work last week was closing up. Carla, the waitress who had slipped him a free coffee that morning, waved discreetly from the window. She was a veteran's daughter, had mentioned her father served in Desert Storm, and seemed to recognize the hollow look in Michael's eyes. "Just hang in there," she'd whispered earlier when her manager wasn't looking. "My dad had rough patches too. It gets better." Michael doubted it. 6 job applications that day alone, all with the same result. "We'll call you." No one wanted to hire a man with trauma-induced tremors and nightmares that woke him screaming at 3 a.m. Dr. Winters at the VA had prescribed pills that made his mind foggy. "PTSD doesn't just go away, Lieutenant," she'd explained during their last session before his medical benefits ran out. "You need consistent therapy." But consistency required money, and money required a job, and jobs required stability, the cruel cycle of civilian life he couldn't seem to break. The bench beneath him was cold, reminding him of nights in mountain outposts where he and his unit, Ramirez, Wilson, Garcia, and Thompson, would huddle together for warmth, Shadow always positioned at the perimeter, alert even in sleep. Thompson had made it home too, but last Michael heard, He was living in his car somewhere in Oregon. At least Thompson didn't have a dog to worry about. Shadow's ears perked up suddenly, his training still sharp despite being 3 years removed from active duty. The dog's alert posture reminded Michael of the day they'd discovered the hidden weapons cache that earned them both commendations. The military police unit had adopted Shadow after Michael had saved him from being euthanized when his first handler was killed in action. The dog wore a faded military collar around his neck. Michael's eyes were tired, his face unshaven for days. 3 days ago, after several warning letters, the landlord had shown up at the door. "Be gone by this time tomorrow," the man had said, pushing the papers against Michael's chest. "Take your damn dog with you." Michael had finally been unable to keep the small house he'd purchased with the money his late Uncle Frank had left him. He had been a hero in the Army. Now he was a homeless veteran. The eviction notice had come just days after Michael's last appeal for increased disability benefits was denied. The VA representative, a young woman with sympathetic eyes but firm words, had explained that his documentation wasn't sufficient to prove his PTSD was service-connected, despite his 3 tours in Afghanistan. "But I was there when the IED hit our convoy," Michael had argued, his voice rising as Shadow pressed closer to his leg, sensing his distress. "I have the scars to prove it." "Physical injuries are covered by your current benefits, Lieutenant Hayes," she'd replied, glancing at her computer screen. "But the psychological assessment doesn't meet the threshold for increased compensation." He'd wanted to tell her about the nightmares, about waking up screaming with Shadow licking his face to bring him back to reality, about how his hands shook so badly some mornings that he couldn't hold a coffee cup, about how loud noises sent him diving for cover, embarrassing him at job interviews. Instead, he'd just nodded and left, Shadow padding quietly beside him through the sterile government building corridor. Uncle Frank would have known what to do. A Vietnam veteran himself, he'd been the one who encouraged Michael to enlist after high school, promising that the military would give him purpose, structure, and a future. For 15 years it had, until that last mission when everything fell apart. The irony wasn't lost on Michael, decorated for bravery in combat, now unable to face a job interview without panic setting in. His therapist, before his insurance ran out, had called it the warrior's paradox, trained to survive in war, unprepared to live in peace. Sergeant Rivera from his old unit had reached out last month, offering his couch in Texas. "Just until you get back on your feet," he'd said. But Rivera's apartment complex had a strict no-pets policy. Michael had politely declined without explanation. The headlights of an approaching bus cut through the darkness of the night. Michael slowly straightened up, placing his hand on Shadow's head. "Next stop, buddy," Michael whispered. "Not the place I promised you, but at least a roof for tonight." Shadow was looking at Michael, endless trust in his eyes. He raised his head and gently touched Michael's hand. Even this small gesture changed Michael's expression, a moment of peace. The bus stopped at the station, doors opening. The driver looked at Michael with sleepy eyes. "Need a ticket for the dog," he said in an indifferent voice. Michael remembered his promise to Shadow when they'd first been paired for training. Captain Reynolds had warned him about getting attached. "These dogs are equipment, Hayes, not pets," he'd cautioned. But that night, when Shadow had whimpered in his kennel, suffering from separation anxiety after losing his previous handler, Michael had snuck out of the barracks and sat beside the cage until dawn. "I won't leave you," he'd promised then. "We're a team." That promise had been tested when Michael was offered a promotion that would have taken him away from the K-9 unit. He'd declined it, much to the bewilderment of his commanding officer. "You're turning down a career advancement for a dog?" Colonel Blackwell had asked incredulously. "Not just a dog, sir," Michael had replied. "My partner." Now, years later, that same loyalty was being tested in different ways. The veterans' shelter in Millfield had beds available. but no pets allowed. The social worker, Ms. Patel, had been sympathetic but firm. "Rules are rules, Mr. Hayes. We can arrange for your dog to go to the animal shelter temporarily." The word temporarily had haunted him. How many military dogs ended up abandoned after their usefulness ended? How many handlers had made promises they couldn't keep? A young woman with a small child boarded the bus ahead of him. The little boy, no more than 5, pointed excitedly at Shadow. "Mommy, look!" A police dog. The mother smiled apologetically at Michael, gently shushing her son. "Actually," Michael said, his voice softer than usual, "he's a war hero." The boy's eyes widened as Michael touched the special commendation tag on Shadow's collar, awarded for detecting an IED that would have killed an entire squad. Michael pulled out the last few crumpled banknotes from his pocket. It was clearly insufficient. Impatience appeared on the driver's face. "This is all I have," said Michael. "I can't go without him." The driver sighed, noticing the expression in Michael's eyes, a soldier's gaze. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice softening. "As far as this will take us." The driver took the money and nodded toward the back. Michael took Shadow and headed toward the rear of the bus. They both settled into the back seat, the dog curling up at Michael's feet. The driver, a man named Earl according to his name tag, had seen his share of down-on-their-luck passengers in his 30 years on the job. Something about this pair, though, the dignified way the man carried himself despite his circumstances, the protective alertness of the dog, struck a chord. Earl had a brother who'd served in Iraq, came back different. Wouldn't talk about what happened over there, but sometimes Earl would catch him staring into nothing, just like this guy was doing now. "Military?" Earl asked quietly as Michael passed him. Michael nodded almost imperceptibly. "3rd Rangers Battalion, retired." "My brother was Army, 2nd Infantry." Earl paused. "Rough transition?" Michael's grip tightened on his bag. "Something like that." Shadow sensed the tension in his handler, pressing closer to Michael's leg. The dog had been through this routine countless times, providing silent comfort when words became too difficult, a living anchor to the present when memories threatened to drag Michael back into the past. 3 rows ahead, an elderly woman with silver hair glanced back at them. Her expression softened as she watched Shadow rest his head protectively on Michael's boot. She reminded Michael of Mrs. Callahan, the Gold Star mother who had approached him at a memorial service 2 years ago, clutching a photo of her son who had served in Michael's unit. "Was he brave at the end?" she had asked, her voice barely audible. Michael had lied then, told her that her son had died instantly, painlessly. He hadn't mentioned the screams, the pleading, the 23 agonizing minutes it had taken for the medevac to arrive. Too late. Some truths weren't meant to be shared. The bus rumbled to life, pulling away from the station. Through the window, Michael caught sight of a recruitment poster, a young soldier standing tall, proud, full of promise. "Be all you can be," it proclaimed in bold letters. He turned away. As the bus moved, Michael looked out the window. The city lights were gradually receding, just like the life they were leaving behind. Memories surfaced in Michael's mind. Him in military uniform, meeting Shadow for the first time in the desert heat. Even then, the dog had formed a special bond with him. Explosions they survived together, countless operations, and finally returning home. And then, nothing being the same as before. 3 years ago, during their last mission in Afghanistan, a mine exploded. The sound was still in his ears. Shadow had pulled him out of the wreckage by dragging him. Captain Daniels had warned him that day not to take Shadow on that particular patrol. Intelligence had reported increased enemy activity in the sector, and Daniels thought it more prudent to send the explosive detection team ahead. "We'll be fine, sir," Michael had insisted. "Shadow can detect those IEDs before any of your equipment can." Daniels had relented, but with a caution. "Your call, Hayes. But remember, overconfidence gets people killed out here." 4 hours into the patrol, they'd entered a village that seemed abandoned. Too quiet, Michael had thought, feeling the hairs on his neck stand up. Shadow had sensed it too, becoming agitated, pulling on his leash, not his usual behavior when detecting explosives. The first shot had come from a rooftop. Then all hell broke loose. In the chaos, Michael had lost track of his team's position. He remembered shouting into his radio, Shadow barking furiously beside him, then the distinct click underfoot that changed everything. In the microsecond before the explosion, Shadow had lunged at him, knocking him partially out of the blast radius. The heat, the pressure wave, the sensation of flying backward. These memories visited him nightly. Then darkness, pain, the copper taste of blood. And through it all, Shadow's persistent tugging at his body armor, dragging him inch by excruciating inch behind a crumbled wall as bullets continued to fly. Specialist Rodriguez had later told him that Shadow had stood guard over his unconscious body, snarling at anyone who approached, even their own medics, until Rodriguez had used the special command phrase that Michael had established for such situations. "That dog of yours saved your life twice that day," Rodriguez had said during a brief hospital visit. First from the blast, then from bleeding out in the open. After that, Rodriguez had deployed again, and Michael had never heard from him since. Michael had been in a coma for 2 weeks. When he woke up, only Shadow was by his side. No one had come to visit. As Michael gently ran his hand along Shadow's back, the dog trembled slightly. "I know," Michael whispered. "I don't like the cold anymore either." Images flashed before his eyes. Rent papers, vacate your home notices, rejection letters from job interviews. "But let me tell you something, Shadow," he continued. "I'll never put you in a shelter. I'll never do that." In the middle of his job search, the words of a restaurant manager had flashed like lightning in his mind. "Come without the dog, and I'll consider it." The rehabilitation center had been the worst. Clinical walls painted in what the brochure called soothing pastels. The physical therapist, Dr. Mercer, had been patient as Michael struggled to regain his balance, his left leg permanently damaged from shrapnel. "You're making progress," Mercer would say encouragingly, marking numbers on his clipboard. But the nightmares had been relentless. Explosions, screams, the smell of burning flesh. The hospital staff had tried to ban Shadow from the recovery room, citing regulations. That was when Colonel Richardson had intervened. A stern woman with silver hair cropped close to her scalp, she'd served 30 years before joining the VA administration. "This dog has PTSD certification paperwork," she'd informed the hospital administrator, sliding a folder across the desk. "Service animal status." Michael later learned that Richardson had expedited the paperwork herself, calling in favors from K-9 unit commanders. "Dogs suffer too," she'd told Michael during one of her visits. "Shadow saw the same hell you did. You need each other." At night, when the pain medication wore off, Shadow would climb carefully onto the hospital bed, positioning himself against Michael's uninjured side. The nurses pretended not to notice. Once discharged, reality had set in quickly. His military pension barely covered rent for their tiny apartment. Job interviews ended the moment potential employers saw his medical history or noticed his service dog. "We appreciate your service," they'd say, not meeting his eyes. "But we're looking for someone with more relevant experience." Relevant experience. As if leading men in combat, making split-second life-or-death decisions, and completing complex missions under extreme pressure weren't transferable skills in the civilian world. The bus traveled for hours. Michael occasionally startled awake from his dozing sleep, each time seeing Shadow still watching him faithfully. Toward morning, they arrived at a small town whose name they didn't even know. When the bus stopped, Michael gathered his remaining belongings and got off with Shadow. Dawn was breaking. Rain had started to drizzle. Michael sat on a bench in a small park, looking at the worn map in his hand. Shadow had curled up at Michael's feet, but his eyes were always alert. "We have 2 options, Shadow," said Michael while looking at the map. Either we go north and try that shelter, or... The town of Oak Ridge was smaller than Michael had expected. A single main street lined with storefronts, half of them empty or boarded up, a diner, a gas station, and what appeared to be a small library at the far end. The kind of place that had probably thrived once, before the factory closed or the highway was rerouted. An older man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the gas station nodded at Michael as they passed. "Morning," he said, his eyes lingering curiously on Shadow's military collar. "Just passing through?" Michael hesitated. Not sure yet. The man, Walt, according to his name patch, leaned on his broom. "Bus only comes through twice a week," he mentioned casually. "Tuesdays and Fridays." Today was Saturday. Michael nodded, absorbing this information. 4 days until the next bus, if they decided to move on. "Town's got a small motel," Walt continued, gesturing down the street. "Nothing fancy, but clean. Mrs. Henley runs it. Tell her Walt sent you." Michael fingered the few remaining bills in his pocket, calculating rapidly. Even with Walt's recommendation, the motel would consume what little money he had left after the bus ticket. "Appreciate it," Michael said finally. "We'll check it out." Shadow had been scanning their surroundings, a behavior ingrained from his military training. The dog's attention kept returning to a small park across the street, where an American flag hung limply from a pole, surrounded by a modest veterans memorial. As they walked toward the motel, Michael noticed a flyer tacked to a telephone pole. "Annual Veterans Appreciation Breakfast, Community Center, 9 a.m. Today's date was circled. His stomach growled involuntarily. They hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. He'd given Shadow the last of their food before boarding the bus. His voice trembled. Shadow raised his head and looked at him, as if saying, "As long as we're together, there's no problem." Michael ran his hand through Shadow's fur, his eyes filling with tears as his fingers disappeared into the animal's coat. "Unlike the others, you're always by my side, aren't you, buddy?" he asked in a low voice. Shadow whimpered softly, reaching toward Michael's face. This simple gesture caused Michael's tears to flow. Throughout his military career, he hadn't cried even during the toughest missions. But now, only he and Shadow remained. He had lost his family, lost his home, lost his reputation. But Shadow was still by his side. The Veterans Appreciation Breakfast was being held in a small community center that doubled as a church on Sundays. As Michael approached, he hesitated, self-conscious about his appearance. His clothes were wrinkled from sleeping on the bus, his face unshaven. But hunger, both his and Shadow's, propelled him forward. Inside, about 24 people milled around folding tables laden with food. The smell of pancakes and coffee made Michael's mouth water. Shadow stayed pressed against his leg, sensing his anxiety. An elderly man in a Korean War veteran cap noticed them first. "Welcome, brother," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Frank Donnelly, VFW Post 237. "Michael Hayes," he replied, shaking the offered hand. "Army, 3rd Rangers." Frank's eyes dropped to Shadow, taking in the military collar and the dog's alert posture. "Service dog?" "Partner," Michael corrected automatically. "We served together. Afghanistan." Frank nodded, understanding immediately. "Come on, get some food. Your partner, too. We've got suitable stuff for him." He lowered his voice. "My son's a K-9 officer with the county sheriff. Always brings his dog to these things." The kindness was almost too much. Michael felt his throat tighten as another veteran, a woman wearing a Desert Storm cap, approached with 2 plates. "I'm Linda," she said, handing him the food. "Marines, motor transport. There's a quiet corner over there if crowds aren't your thing." She nodded toward a table partially screened by a partition. "That's where I usually sit." As they ate, Michael noticed several people glancing their way, not with judgment, but with recognition. These people understood, in a way civilians never could, the invisible wounds that came home from war. He folded the map and put it in his pocket. Just a month ago, sitting in his living room, he had seen a news report on television about a veteran, hero soldier retired with the nation's gratitude. The veteran on the screen was smiling at the cameras. Michael smiled bitterly. No one had called him a hero. There was just a new bill and a warning paper saying, "Don't bring your dog inside," on his door. The rain intensified. Michael stood up, slung his bag over his shoulder. "Let's go," he said. "We need to find shelter." Frank approached their table as they finished eating. "Where are you staying in town?" he asked casually. Michael hesitated. "Just passing through," he said vaguely. Frank's weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen his share of broken soldiers, understood. "Our post has a small apartment upstairs," he said. "Nothing fancy. Used to be the caretaker's place. Been empty since old Jenkins passed last year." Michael started to shake his head, pride rising like a wall. "Look," Frank continued, "place is just gathering dust. Post needs someone to keep an eye on things overnight. Couple of break-ins last month. Would actually be doing us a favor." Before Michael could respond, a middle-aged woman in a sheriff's uniform approached. "Frank giving you his caretaker speech?" she asked with a knowing smile. "I'm Sheriff Wilson, Sarah Wilson." "Michael Hayes," he replied automatically, years of military courtesy taking over. "Sarah's husband was Army," Frank explained. "Served with the 101st in Iraq." "Was?" Sarah said softly. "Brian didn't make it home. IED outside Fallujah." Her eyes drifted to shadow. "He loved dogs. Had one assigned to his unit. Saved his platoon more than once," Brian wrote. The unspoken understanding passed between them, the shared language of loss and service. "The apartment needs someone," Sarah continued, "and the diner in town needs help for the breakfast and lunch shifts. Owner's my cousin, nothing glamorous, but—" She trailed off. Michael looked down at Shadow, who returned his gaze steadily. In the dog's eyes, he saw the same truth he'd always known. They would face whatever came next together. "We'd be grateful," Michael said finally, his voice barely audible above the chatter of the breakfast gathering. "For a chance." And in that moment, surrounded by strangers who somehow felt like family, Michael realized they might have found not just shelter, but perhaps, eventually, a home. This brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching. Till the end, I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel.